What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we got a pretty cool, just random content drop from Games Workshop, that being profiles to play in Warhammer 40k datasheets for the kill team teams that have been releasing most recently. So these are the Imperial Breachers, Chaos Traitor Guardsmen, Eleusidian Starstriders, and Kroot Farstalkers. So let's go over the datasheets and talk about what they bring to Warhammer 40,000. First off, we'll talk about the Traitor Guardsmen, which come with two individual datasheets, the Traitor Enforcer as well as the Guardsmen themselves. Now, the cool thing about these guys is that we're definitely trying to ape the Astra Militarum's order mechanic, but in a way that functions well within a Heretic Astartes army. The Traitor Guardsmen themselves aren't too much to talk about. They are basically just an Imperial Guard unit with the Traitorous Astartes keyword and the Legion keyword, meaning that they can be taken in detachments from the Chaos Space Marine Codex proper. While they all have las guns, they have some interesting selections for their war gear, including sniper rifles, plasma guns, and melta-guns. But unlike their loyalist counterparts, they do actually have to pay for most of those upgrades, so that is a little bit of a downside. Most interestingly, they can also take a Voxcaster, which then unlocks some of their synergy with the Traitor Enforcer. The Enforcer himself has one, I guess, quote-unquote order ability, which is that he can make Traitor Guardsmen automatically immune to combat attrition once per turn. The range of the ability is normally 6 unless the Guardsman unit has a Voxcaster, in which case the Enforcer can radio over his orders and spread the range of that ability to 24 inches instead. Unfortunately for Guardsmen, I don't think that combat attrition is the most dangerous thing for them. Generally speaking, they're going to get killed by actual just enemy attacks, so keeping them alive with a 45-point character isn't the most exciting thing. For that reason, the character also brings a Traitor Ogryn alongside in order to make the unit a little bit harder punching in melee. Heretic Astartes typically have a glut of HQs that they want to be taking, so the Traitor Enforcer being an elite slot is actually pretty cool for this reason. He is a character keyworded and Legion keyworded, so a lot of the Heretic Astartes synergies can be applied to him, and he himself comes rocking a Power Fist. So he comes in with a base profile of 3 attacks, hitting on 4s with a Strength 6 AP 3 2 damage attack. Not too bad. That Traitor Ogryn, however, for an initial 65 points, comes in with an extra 5 attacks from his Scavenged Maul, which is a Strength 7 AP 1 2 damage swing, and 1 attack from a Strength 6 AP 2 3 damage Claw attack. Now, the interesting thing about this guy as well is that he gets out ahead of the discussion of how mixed toughness units works. As long as you have a Traitor Ogryn, the Ogryn himself is -1 damage. You use the toughness value of the Ogryn, and any damage the unit receives has to be applied to the Ogryn first. The downside here is that the refractor field that the Enforcer carries only affects himself, so while the Ogryn is going to be taking all the fire, he's only going to be taking it on a 5+ armor save, which makes him not actually that hard to kill. Although, obviously, with the unit being character keyworded, these guys are relatively hard to shoot at, so they're going to get to stuck in before they get killed. That said, for 110 points, this is probably a lot, especially in Heretic Astartes, where you have a lot of really powerful combat characters. But if you're already taking Traitor Guardsmen in your army, you might want to consider it. The thing I like most about this is that it really fills out the cultist sub-theme that Heretic Astartes have. They already have a lot of internal synergies with cultists, but up until the latest edition, cultist keyworded units haven't been super common. Now we have things like accursed cultists, Traitor Enforcers, and Guardsmen to go along with the standard Chaos Cultists, and so if you wanted to build out a large volume of cultist units, you could probably do that pretty effectively. Whether or not to be able to deal any damage is the other question, although accursed cultists are pretty efficient for their points cost, the rest of the army is mostly just objective secured guys. Would have been cool to see some ability to bring other Traitor Astra Militarum units in alongside these guys if they unlock slots to take things like Leman Russ or Chimeras. I think that would be pretty sweet, but I'll take what I can get. Let's move on to the Kroot Farstalker unit. These guys are basically a Kroot Carnivore unit with a couple of extra steps. They have a lot of the same abilities that standard Kroot Carnivores do, including ambushing predators to give them a 9-inch pregame move, and stealthy hunters to give them +1 to their saving throws while they're benefiting from cover. They also have, interestingly, the Bounty Hunters keyword, which they do pay a little bit of a point tax for. This lets them select an enemy unit at the start of the game to get full hit rerolls against. This is going to make Kroot Farstalkers pretty decent shaft clearers, since they're going to be able to choose potentially large hordes of enemies and then make use of their relatively high volume of attacks with full rerolls to clear out those guys pretty quickly. It's not really something that Tau have ever had trouble with, so I don't really know if these guys have a particular place in a normal Tau army. I have in the past talked about on stream making an entirely Kroot army, which is technically possible, but if you're trying to build out a 2,000 point Warhammer 40,000 army, it actually gets extremely difficult because a lot of Kroot units are restricted by rule of 3. And with only one HQ choice, you're actually restricted on the number of detachments you can squeeze in. Having an additional elite slot in these Kroot Farstalkers, and one that has some pretty appreciable attacks. That said, despite being in the elite slot, they're not actually doing too much that a normal Kroot Carnivore squad couldn't. For 8 points a model, you basically just buy that Bounty Hunter's ability as well as an expanded set of war gear that this unit can pay for. There are some interesting picks in there, including Londoxy Tribalists, which shoot at strength 7, AP 1 for 3 damage against vehicle targets with a 3-shot profile. You also have the normal selection of being able to take Tau weapons like pulse carbines and pulse rifles, as well as a few shotguns and a flamer equivalent profile. They also, if they take a Pekra, have the ability to ignore cover, so the unit can be relatively effective at infantry clearing. Mostly a fluff include, since unlike Kroot Carnivores, they can't fill those compulsory troop slots, so I don't know how often you're going to see these guys, but again, if you're trying to build full Kroot army, certainly helps a lot. Last but certainly not least, we'll talk about the remaining brace of datasheets altogether, since they basically represent the introduction of a new sub-faction to the Imperial super faction of Warhammer 40k. These are the Rogue Traders and Imperial Breachers, as we've seen from the previous Eleusidian Starstrider release, and obviously the new Killsteam starter set that the Breachers come from. These are all unified by the Novice Imperialis keyword, which theoretically would allow them to be taken in detachments and armies themselves, although, as we'll talk about, some of the special abilities will actually preclude that, which kind of sucks. Starting off with the Cartographica Rogue Trader, this is actually an amalgamation of a bunch of old Eleusidian Starstrider datasheets. Each of the Starstrider units used to be an individual special character, meaning you could only take one of each in your army, but now they've all been made generic, and the Rogue Trader has actually adopted a lot of the individual elite character models into a retinue that can accompany her. The Rogue Trader herself is kind of a badass. She's got a 4+ invulnerable save, a total of 6 AP2 melee attacks, and a command phase ability to give an Imperialis core unit +1 to hit in the command phase. She can then take one each of a Death Cult Executioner, Lectromaester, or Rejuvenate Adept to increase the power of her unit. They'll still be a character unit, meaning that they are going to be untargetable, but they're going to make her a little bit tougher to remove and do a little bit more damage. The Death Cult Executioner for 15 points gives you 5 additional AP3 melee attacks, which is pretty sweet. The Rejuvenate Adept can protect the 2 with a 5+ damage ignore, which makes the unit a little bit of a boatload of wounds to remove. And the Electromaester can improve their relatively mediocre AP values by giving them a little bit of a rending ability, +1 AP on wound rolls of 6. Whether or not you bulk out this unit a lot is probably up for debate, but if you're also taking Novice Imperialis units elsewhere in your army, it's kind of nice to be able to get the synergy between the Rogue Trader and them themselves. The downside here comes from this Master and Commander ability, which only allows a single Rogue Trader to be in each detachment, which makes a ton of sense. There's only one captain of the ship. You're not going to be taking too many of these ladies, but on the flip side, you cannot fill compulsory battlefield role slots with them. And this, unfortunately, is not restricted by the type of detachment that she's in. So even if she's in a Novice Imperialis detachment, you will not be able to fill the compulsory HQ slots that that detachment requires. Meaning that, like I said before, while this is basically a new sub-faction, it's actually physically impossible to take a pure detachment from it outside of taking an auxiliary detachment. All of these units can be included in other Imperial detachments, however, and they still do not stop you from benefiting from detachment abilities or faction abilities. I just wish you could take individual detachments of them themselves. We now have enough units to be able to take a pretty sweet patrol or battalion out of Novice Imperialis to ally with an Astra Militarum army or a Space Marine army, which I'm not sure, while it's super strong, is very cool and very flavorful. Downside is we just can't do that, so, you know, that sucks. Honestly, I think this was probably an oversight on GW's part, because if we start looking at the other data sheets in this document, including the Void's Men-at-Arms, they do have a similar ability, the Shipborne Personnel ability, that only allows them to be taken as compulsory units in a Novice Imperialis detachment. I'm pretty sure that Games Workshop wrote that Master and Commander rule without recognizing that it would actually stop Novice Imperialis detachments from forming. That is really awkward, but, you know, that's classic GW. You know, someday they'll learn how to write words. The Void's Men-at-Arms have changed a little bit from their previous version. At 10 points a model, they're a little bit more expensive and no longer a 3+ ballistic skill, but A 4+ armor save is pretty nice for this little objective holding unit. They're a troops option that gets this cool, flavorful ability, Masters of Close Confines. It gives them exploding 6s, targeting units within 12 inches. Makes a ton of sense since they're going to be practiced at fighting in the close corridors of a spaceship. Their weapon loadout has changed a little bit. Every model has a las gun besides the Void Master, who's bringing his pretty cool 2-damage Artificer shotgun profile. However, their weapon upgrades are now free, meaning that you can take a rotor cannon, a 4-shot strength 6 AP1 heavy weapon for no additional charge. Pretty big upgrade to a las gun, in my opinion. Now, the single biggest change to this data sheet, and the real one that's going to determine whether or not we see them quite often in competitive play, is what's not printed on it, and that is the Warrant of Trade ability. This ability used to allow Voidsmen-at-Arms to enter vehicles regardless of their faction keywords or unit keywords, which allowed them to unlock transports like Landspeeder Storms, a very efficient unit in the Space Marine Codex that would previously only be unlocked and be occupiable by scout units. This ability no longer exists, which makes it much harder to justify the inclusion of Voidsmen in any Space Marine armies. Last, but certainly not least, we do have the Imperial Navy Breachers, and these guys are very similar to the Voidsmen-at-Arms, I think appropriately so. That said, the Breachers have upgraded equipment, being Imperial-sanctioned military units and getting all of the benefit of that Imperial funding. Each of them has a shotgun, a 2-shot strength 4 weapon, and their armor is reinforced as Void Armor, an ability that we'll recognize from Leagues of Votann. Votann technology is clearly significantly superior to Imperial technology, since these guys lack the no rerolls clause that Leagues of Votann had innately. I don't know if that's like a mistake or we're just throwing shaded Imperial units, but they just got worse Void Armor than the Leagues of Votann do. That kind of sucks. To shore up that survivability, however, one of the models in the unit is automatically equipped with an Endurance Shield, which gives it a 5+ invulnerable save and adds 1 to its saving throws. This is a combat shield ability, but importantly, does not clash with Void Armor, unlike Armor of Contempt in Space Marines, where Storm Shields or Combat Shields will prevent you from benefiting from Armor of Contempt. This Void Armor will still trigger, meaning that this guy, as long as you have an AP value, is basically a 2+ save. The weird part is that he also has a heavy shotgun, which is basically just 2 shotguns stapled together. So the model in your unit that's dealing the most damage is also the most survivable, which means that you probably don't want to allocate saves to him. A little bit funky, but I don't know. It's nice to have the additional shotgun attacks. One model also gets a heavy weapon, a Novice Las Volley, which is exactly the same profile as the rotor cannon we talked about in the Voidsmen-at-Arms data sheets. However, he has a couple upgrades, including the ability to take a Melt-A-Gun or Plasma Gun to give the unit a little bit of additional anti-tank. Speaking of anti-tank, they can also equip a demolition charge, but for the high cost of 10 points, which is probably more than you want to be spending on these guys, especially since all their other upgrades are either free or only 5 points in the case of the Melt-A-Gun or Plasma Gun. Those free upgrades can include some melee upgrades with the ability to take a Chain Fist or a Power Axe, some pretty flavorful weapons at getting through the bulkheads of spaceships. Now, importantly as well, for these guys' survivability, they also have the smokescreen keyword, meaning that most of the time you'll be able to spend a CP when they're targeted to make them -1 to be hit. That's good at increasing their survivability a little bit more with what is essentially a 3+ armor save. They're not the easiest unit in the game to kill. However, at 10 points per model, you don't really want to be spending that on toughness 3 units that unfortunately are probably not going to be objective secured, since again, they're going to be sitting in that Agent of the Imperium slot rather than an actual troop slot. Annoyingly, they also have this ability where they can only be compulsory troops in a Novice Imperialis attachment, but again, we have no HQs that can be taken in the compulsory slots of that Novice Imperialis attachment, and to my knowledge, I did do some digging. I don't believe that there are any existing Novice Imperialis units in the game. There's some Novice Nobilitae, but no Novice Imperialis. Breaching units are one of my favorite thematically, and I do like the weapon loadout that this unit can take, especially when mixing it up with other chaff infantry. Thematically, it makes a ton of sense that these guys would be able to wade through the unwashed masses that take up residence in the bowels of ships in the 41st millennium. With decent saves and a very good war gear, they'd be able to take unarmed ships pretty easily. Once they hit resistance, they'll have a little bit of trouble, but if all you need is a unit that can clear out enemy objective grabbers, these guys are going to do a really good job at it. Not to mention that there's that internal synergy with the rogue trader as well, who could give them +1 to hit, being a core unit. So all in all, I don't know if we're going to be seeing these units too often on the tables of Warhammer 40k. I do really like them thematically, and I really like their inclusion in the game as basically a way to just deepen the background and make the universe feel a little bit more alive. And I'm sure that there are hundreds of millions of Imperial Navy breachers who are on the many tens of thousands of Imperial Navy ships across the entirety of the galaxy. So having them represented in the game and getting a little bit of knowledge of their capabilities is really cool. If you want to get access to these datasheets yourself, they are available now on Warhammer Community. Just go to warhammercommunity.com and hit the download section. There is also an FAQ section that a lot of people go to for Warhammer 40,000. These are not there. You have to go to downloads. Very important to note. And with that, that's all we're going to talk about today. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people are awesome and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Trade ability. For fuck's sake, Inky.